Hello, this is the race for the poles. Why both? Because the quest to reach the North and South poles first were very closely linked, and not in the way you'd expect, as in they're both poles. You see, the only reason there was a race for the South Pole at all was because of drama at the North Pole. For the longest time, the North Pole was the crown jewel of polar exploration. There had been many attempts to reach it over the years, including one by the British in 1827 that included one Francis Crozier. One of the men who tried to reach it over the years was Robert Peary, an American who'd led several failed attempts. He led his final attempt in 1909, accompanied by Matthew Henson and some Inuit guides. And most people credit him with reaching it first, but the weird fact is, we don't know. The North Pole is not like the South, it's not on an actual continent. It's on a frozen sea floating at the top of the planet. The ice is always moving, so you can't leave a flag as proof. As a result, verifications required careful checking of navigation data recorded by men on the mission, and Peary's data was far from definite. Not only that, but Frederick Cook claimed he'd made it a full year before Peary. Cook had accompanied Peary in an earlier attempt and they'd become bitter enemies over the years. Cook was the surgeon on Peary's 1891 expedition. He spent his time studying Inuit culture, dressing in furs and learning to live off the land. When they returned home, he requested permission to publish a book on his experiences and what he'd learned, but Peary refused to allow him. It was his expedition and he wouldn't let anyone else take his limelight. So from then out, Peary and Cook were rivals. Peary would go north time after time, knowing that he didn't have many more goes in him, while Cook had to build up his reputation to get support for his own journey north. Cook went to the Antarctic on a ship called the Belgica, which accidentally became the first ship to spend the southern winter in Antarctica. This wasn't planned, so they had limited supplies, and Cook was part of the reason they survived the experience. The fresh meat he brought in kept the men fed and scurvy-free. Another important crewman in the expedition was one Roald Amundsen, who became a lifelong friend of Cook's. Cook also claimed to be the first man to summit Mount Denali, aka Mount McKinley. There was only one photograph taken of the climb, and it's a striking shot, and I'll be coming back to this later. Peary was publicly preparing for his final attempt on the pole. He was very well backed and even had a ship designed to get him as far north as possible before he had to start walking. Earlier attempts had ships that couldn't handle the ice, meaning he had to be left off further south, adding hundreds of miles to the journey. On the other hand, Cook had Cook and two Inuit guides. Cook entered the Arctic 14 months before Peary and emerged 5 days before his arrival. He claims that he and his guides went north from Greenland, made it to the pole, and had some bad luck on the return journey, getting trapped on an island until the next year's winter. Cook claimed they lived off the land like he had done in Antarctica. Peary's account of going north is much simpler. He and his men went north, his final party broke off from the rest and made the final leg of the journey and then returned. Sounds simple, cut and dried, but this is anything but simple, cut or dried. When Peary emerged from the Arctic, he immediately started attacking Cook, claiming he was a liar and a fraud. Cook, to begin with, was magnanimous and said there was glory enough for them both, but the attacks continued, and Cook dropped out of the picture, complaining of mental fatigue. For about a year, Peary made his accusations and Cook didn't return them, and the public's opinion fell behind Peary. Then the actual analysis of both men's journeys began. Cook gave his records to the University of Copenhagen to check. They decided there was nowhere near enough of them and declared them inconclusive. Peary handed his to the National Geographic Society, who declared his accurate. Case closed? No, not case closed. Peary was funded by the National Geographic Society, while the University of Copenhagen was a third party with no connection to Cook. And many of Cook's records were allegedly lost when he left them with an American hunter called Harry Whitney, who was to bring them from northern Greenland. Cook, you see, had already gone south to tell the world that he conquered the pole. Whitney was forced to leave the records in Greenland when the ship he was taking wouldn't allow Cook's boxes on board. The ship was Peary's, the Roosevelt, that had taken him north. The National Geographic Society refused to release Peary's records to a third party to check and declared the matter settled. Decades later, people did check and found problems. When Peary and his small team broke away from the much larger party for the final push on the pole, they made incredible speed, much faster than expected, much faster than most people think is reasonable. And different members of the party gave wildly different descriptions of the journey. Peary was also the only person in his final team who knew to check and confirm their progress and record it in a proper way. If they made it to the pole, the others wouldn't know about it until he told them. And if they didn't, he could lie. Not to say the Inuit guides that went with Peary couldn't navigate. Obviously they could, but they didn't use the same techniques, so were useless when it came to official records. There's also problems with Peary's diary. Blank pages, the note, "the pole at last," and a loose page that might be from another book entirely. Basically, we have no idea if Peary made it, or if he didn't, how close he got. but some estimates think he was about 60 miles off. Cook's claim isn't really any better. Worse, actually, what with the lack of records. It was claimed that Cook's Inuit guides confessed that they only travelled a short distance, though that claim was made by people working for Peary. He and his companions drew a map of their route depicting a then undiscovered island, Meighen Island, officially discovered in 1916. And the island that Cook claimed they stayed at on the journey back is real. It's called Devon Island. Enjoy that, there's not much here that's definite. Even the 14 months that Cook allegedly spent in the Arctic is controversial, with some historians believing he made the pole, others believing he spent the time in the Arctic but didn't make the pole, and others who think he only travelled a short distance. And very weirdly, one or two think the journey described was borrowed from a Jules Verne book. Cook would occasionally produce more records that he claimed he held onto, though they were always inconclusive. So why did so many people believe Peary over Cook? As with anything this big, there's probably too many reasons to list, each contributing something, but Cook's disappearance, Peary attacking Cook relentlessly, the fact that Peary's records were checked by his own backers, the claimed loss of much of Cook's records, Cook's operation being bare bones compared to the well-backed Peary, but there's another thing. Quite a big another thing. Back to Mount McKinley, that's a very nice picture. It's also a fraud. That's not the summit of Mount McKinley, that's a much smaller summit some 19 miles away. It's called the Fake Peak. That doesn't prove they didn't summit Mount McKinley though, except Edward Burrill, Cook's companion on the climb, signed an affidavit claiming they didn't reach the summit. Oh, so that settles it? No, because it's since been proved that Burrill was paid by Peary supporters right before he signed it. So he did reach it? Maybe not, because no one since has managed to confirm the details Cook described on the mountain. So again, we don't know. But what's important is that the reveal of the photograph as a fake and the affidavit by Burrill was the final nail in Cook's coffin. And the fact that he went to prison for fraud years later didn't help his reputation any. So what we have here are two men. One is a horribly unpleasant person with dodgy evidence who has every reason to lie. Another who seems to be operating honestly and suffered bad luck, who also has dodgy evidence and was definitely some kind of fraud. So we don't know. Anyway, why did Cook probably lie about summiting Mount McKinley? Lots of possible reasons. The most charitable is that you need money to make money. To get the funding needed to achieve stuff, you need to have achieved stuff. To make things even worse, the next man to claim to make it to the North Pole, Admiral Robert Byrd, who flew over it, also has severe question marks about his achievement. So, who made it to the pole first? We don't know. No one does. Historians are divided, though Peary's claim looks much less secure now than it did when he died in 1920. Though that's not to say that Cook's has got any better with time. We know who the first person to definitely make it was. That was Roald Amundsen. He flew over it a few days after Robert Byrd might have. We know who the first person to definitely make it on foot was. That was Ralph Pleisted. Like Peary, Cook and Byrd, he's an American, so it's nice that America has finally, definitely made it. The last irony in all this is that even if Peary got to the pole first, he probably didn't get there first. That honour probably goes to Matthew Henson and one of the Inuit guides. Anyway, Amundsen being the first person to definitely make it to the North Pole is deeply funny, because that was always his dream. But he pushed for the South Pole instead when the dream was snatched from him by Peary and or Cook. Now, who do I think made it to the pole? I think Amundsen made it, and I wouldn't put any money on the guys who came before him. If I had to choose, I think I have a soft spot for Cook. Yes, he lied about McKinley, but he also kept a crew alive in Antarctica. He earned the respect of the greatest polar explorer in history, Roald Amundsen, and unlike Peary, he didn't make the fight personal. And say what you will about Cook, he didn't sell Inuit corpses to a museum. In many ways, Peary was the last Victorian explorer. He was obsessed with conquering the pole, he sacrificed much of his life and parts of his body to do it, allegedly. He exploited the Inuit, while Cook was one of the first modern explorers, more interested in knowledge than personal glory, learning from the Inuit. Watching all this play out had a severe impact on Amundsen. He knew for damn sure he was not going to risk a repeat of this debacle when he went south, which I'll talk about in part 2.